Happy Sabbath to you. Oh, yes, very. It's only by the grace of God I'm here. There are more reasons for me not to be here than there are to be here.
This right here, and Juanita, if you want it, you just got to tell me, okay, JD or myself. I'll sit right here. It's all within reach. Let's hear.
I could not pass a drug test this morning, I guarantee you. The song service this morning, it took me back, I won't tell you how many years, but let's put it more than 50. Okay. And Elder HMS Richards, his favorite song was Look for the Waymarks. And I remember being on the platform with him, with the King's Heralds, and we're up there, and he says, we've got to sing Look for the Waymarks. And to hear that man lift his voice and look for the waymarks, and away he went, favorite song. I'd like to give you just a little update. Many of you asked about Kelly and her situation. They did an ultrasound on her. They did find the mass. And so they are going to take her in and do an MRI on her, and just to see how extensive it really is. And then she'll be referred to an oncologist surgeon, and we'll take it from there. But you've asked, and I appreciate your asking, and she appreciates your prayers. I told her last week when she came over, I said, the church is praying for you, and she says, thanks. She says, I need it. So thank you for your prayers and your concern. Like I said, it's one of those things I thought about not coming this morning, but I said, you can't, David. Your name's already in the bulletin. You're obligated. And then as I was showering this morning, I bent over and my back went out. So like I said, I've got more reasons not to be here than to be here, but I said, Lord, if you want me to be there, I'm going. And so with his help and the prayer you had, JD, we will be able to make it through our lesson this morning. And I guess I should say to those of you out there who are watching online, for me to try to teach this lesson after Elder Jim Merrills was here last week, I think is redundant, okay? Because he dissected it so well last Sabbath for our morning worship hour. So I prayed that God would give me some insights and things that we could discuss in addition to what we had studied with Brother Merrills last Sabbath morning. And so with God's help and your participation, I'm sure we're going to make it fine. From the stormy sea to the clouds of heaven. I read that title and I said, what? What has that got to do with the vision that Daniel had? And then I saw that the stormy sea represented the waters of the earth and the nations that rise out. And the culmination is Christ coming in the clouds of heaven. Then I got it. There's one thing I want you to understand. This is the second time Daniel had a vision. The first time it was presented to the king, and the king wanted to know what the vision was all about. So God gave Daniel the vision, and he was able to expound upon it to the king. Then here we are. Daniel is now under the Medes and the Persians. So this must be about some 70 to 75 years later in his life. And this time the dream and vision only comes to Daniel. And what this I feel is a further, deeper expounding into what the first vision meant. So the first vision meant, it had quite a few generalities. Heads of gold, brass and iron and all the rest of that. Gold, silver, brass, and iron. This goes into more detail. And why do you think God had it in more detail as you were reading through it?
So people can be more prepared, so they can get a better understanding and more information.
Daniel wrote this, and I believe God meant it for us. Because to Daniel, there were things that he couldn't even imagine. And then when he got down to the fourth beast, it doesn't even tell you what it is. It was just a terrible beast. And this really upset Daniel as he was going through the vision. This terrible beast, what is this all about? He understood the head of gold. He understood the lion. Okay. And then he was living through the bear. But these others, the leopard, and then the terrible beast, those were things he did not know. And it was meant to be passed down to us. Starting our lesson now, I'm going to read in here in the first paragraph we had. I'd like to start down. The first division occurs at night and portrays the sea agitated by the four winds. Darkness and water evoke creation, but here creation appears to somehow be distorted under the attack. Second, the animals in the vision are unclean and hybrid, which represents a violation of the created order. Third, the animals are portrayed as exerting dominion. Thus, it appears that dominion God gave to Adam in the garden has been usurped by these powers. Fourth, with the coming of the Son of Man, God's dominion is restored to those to whom it properly belongs. What Adam lost in the garden, the Son of Man recovers in the heavenly judgment. And that took me back to something that Ellen White wrote. And I says, this is going to be something wonderful for us to see. When we get to heaven, and she tells us that Adam is going to bow before his Creator and have a crown put on his head. And I got thinking about that. This is the first time since he was expelled from the Garden of Eden that he's going to see his Creator face to face. It says that the angels will put there was flaming swords so that he could not go back in to the Garden of Eden. And here he is on the sea of glass, standing before the one who created him. And then Adam realizes when he looks at Christ, the scars, what it cost for him to be saved. And I told you before, the one thing I want to do when I get to heaven, please don't take this as egotistical because it's not meant in that way. I want to meet the Father. I want to tell him, thank you. Something I do not deserve cost the life of your Son. That me, so unworthy, can be here. That means so much to me. And I'll tell you, that's the one burning desire I have in my life. Yes, you want to take the mic, Rodney?
Even though it cost Jesus life and he was raised again, didn't it also cost him his physical condition and limitations?
Yes. The thing about it, you say his physical limitations, yes. His physical limitations in that he is forever human. But as I was looking at my lesson here, I said, it was a human that fell. So there's no way that a deity could restore it. So it had to be that a human is the one who restored it. Because that was Satan's contention from the very beginning. He says, there is no way that anybody can obey all of these religious things you've got up here. He says, didn't you create Adam? Yes. Well, you put him in a perfect circumstances, right? Yes. And he couldn't make it. So how do you expect a human being to make it? It's a pretty good argument when Satan comes to you. Yes, Juanita.
Well, this is getting way off topic from yours, but I was impressed in that first paragraph that you've already read. It talks about the fact that the animals were in the vision were unclean and hybrid. And I think that that's meaningful. And this, and when we get into next week's lesson, we don't necessarily need to discuss it now, but it occurred to me that the two beasts that we see in next week's lesson, and I haven't read ahead, so I don't know if the lesson brings this out, but I think it's probably very important as we understand the atoning work of Christ. The two beasts there, the sheep and the goat, were both clean animals, and not only were they clean animals, they were animals that were used on the Day of Atonement in the wilderness sanctuary. And then the other point that I wanted to make as I was listening to what you were just saying was, last night I was watching on YouTube a series of sermons by Elder DeVasher that he did a few years ago, and it was a series of 4 sermons that were probably a week of prayer study. But anyway, in one of the sermons, he was making the point about how this whole plan of redemption needed to be played out. And part of the problem, or part of the foundation for how it needed to play, why it needed to play out the way it did, and why it needed to take over 6,000 years, was that we had an argument that started in heaven where Jesus was saying one thing and Satan was lying about him. Well, when you're in a situation where you have a lie, it's he said, she said. One person says, yes, I did, and the other person says, no, you didn't, and one said, yes, I did, and the other one said, no, you didn't, and you don't get anywhere without evidence. And so God needed evidence. And so this all had to play out with evidence, so it wasn't just Jesus' word against Satan's word, because you don't get anywhere. And so all of these things had to play out over 6,000 years so that God could be vindicated. And we're seeing in this vision in Daniel 7 just one piece of how God gets vindicated in that whole argument between Christ and Satan.
Therefore, God wanted to be said throughout all ages that He is just. He is fair. Because that's what they had maintained was not so. Satan maintained God was not just, God was not fair. How could anybody do this? It's impossible. It's impossible. All right, getting on like Juanita brought up the 4 animals. Lion. A lion is most fitting representation of Babylon. Winged lions decorated palace walls and other works of Babylonian art. The lion depicted in the vision eventually has its wings pulled off, is made to stand upright like a man, and receives a human heart. This process symbolized the Babylonian Empire under its king. The bear. The bear represents the Medo-Persian Empire. The fact that it is raised up on one side indicates the superiority of the Persians over the Medes. The 3 ribs between its teeth stand for the 3 main conquests of the Medo-Persian Empire: Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt. The leopard, the swift leopard, represents the Greek Empire established by Alexander the Great. The 4 wings make the beast even swifter, an apt representation of Alexander, who in a few years brought the entire world under his dominion. And the nondescript animal, other than the fact that it is dreadful and terrible. Whereas the previous entities only resemble the animals mentioned, this one is an entity unto itself. That is, the first ones are depicted like a lion, like a bear, but one not depicted like anything. This multi-horned beast also appears far more cruel and rapacious than the previous ones. As such, it is a fitting representation of pagan Rome, which conquered, ruled, and trampled the world with its feet. And in London today, you can see the roads that the Romans built. They were ruling with the iron fist, the armies. They controlled people. You did as they were said. So the world, this was the longest ruling kingdom. So the world was already under the oppression of Rome, And when the great king was toppled, the world was all ready for oppression by the church. This was a softening up process that the Romans did, so that when the papal authority began to rule, it was already prepared where they could rule. You know, I was thinking about that. Today, there is still a Vatican kingdom. It's a kingdom that still exists in Rome. It has its own guard. It has its own king, if you want to say that, the Pope. It has its emissaries sent around the world, the cardinals and the bishops. In other words, it did not appear when you first think about this of how extensive their influence is, their strength. Going down to the note under there, I wrote in here, when we go through all this and we see how everything has happened, time, right on time. It didn't come a year off or a year ahead of time. It came right on time. So the question is asked there, it says, if you read that down, it says, what does this teach us about the trustworthiness of Scripture? I mean, how people can tell me that Scripture doesn't mean anything. It's just a book that was written. Yeah, it's a book that was written, but it is the greatest and most accurate book ever written in history. And it was written, a lot of it, telling about what was going to happen. You see, it's easy for us in one of my worst subjects I took in school was history. I did not care about history. I'm sorry. That was 1066 and Battle of Hastings. How do I care? How does it affect David in 1956 and 57 when I was studying it? It didn't mean jack diddly to me. And my teacher found that out, and thank goodness she graded it on the curve, because 100 points possible in in the class, in the test, the smartest girl in our class got a 38, and she was smart. So my 27 didn't look so bad. Okay? When in reality, if you put my 100% against 27%, I didn't learn anything. The teachers were great. It was the students who were the problem. And I got to tell you, I've told you before, I was not a model student. I was a model you didn't want your children to behave like. All right. So I plead guilty. God will forgive me. I pray for forgiveness. But you see, when I look at history and I look at how accurate the Bible has been, how can people not look around and see? And I think about this too. As I studied this lesson this week, well, the last great thing here of the great horned beast, we had that in 1798, he was taken captive by Napoleon. Wow, 1798, and we're in 2020. Elder Richards used to say, his coming is at the door. He is even at the door. That doesn't scare me a bit. I tell you, I don't live a perfect life. I commit sins daily. But I pray for forgiveness because I want to leave. I've been here almost 80 years. I think it's time I leave. But I don't want to die. I've told you many times I have no fear of death. But I don't want to die. I could you one morning